Right, well, the Gauteng Chairperson, David Makhura, is currently addressing delegates at the 14th Provincial Conference, which is currently underway in Benoni. The conference early experienced delays due to matters of the quarantined Ekurhuleni votes. Let's listen in to Makhura.
To ensure that they are principal beneficiaries of our interventions. In this regard, programs such as the Presidential Youth Employment Initiatives, which is already working in our province. More than 42,000 young people are in our schools, helping our schools to ensure that there's better teaching. They support administration, they support learning, teaching and learning. Those programs must be expanded. Those programs must reach more young people. And in that sense, we need programs that are more proactive and more impactful amongst young people. So the last major trend, which we come back to elaborate, is this question that, in fact, the tendency in the world is that neoliberalism, which 30 years ago, at the end of the 1980s, this is something our Provincial Executive Committee has been discussing for 2 years. At the end of the 1980s, at the beginning of the 1990s, we had a dominant trend. A dominant trend was the collapse of those Eastern European socialist states was celebrated as the triumph of neoliberalism, as an assertion that the only way you can organize the world, you can organize human life, you can organize economies, is by placing market fundamentalism at the center of everything else. So this was a dominant ideological trend, but we know that we are at a moment where that dominant trend, that the market cannot be the be-all and end-all. We need effective states. The market can't solve all human problems. We need effective states, we need effective civil society to address various human problems. We need effective institutions in combination with the market mechanism, but the market mechanism must also be subordinated to the interest of humanity. So in that sense, so the debate 30 years ago was big question marks about the future of the progressive left, the future of left-wing progressive ideas. It was a big question mark that this cannot work. Any left-wing alternative, any progressive alternative will not work. But we know in the last decade in particular, the evidence is pointing to the contrary, that in fact there is a multiple crisis of what would have been put forward as a solution to all human problems. So neoliberalism, which was presented as the only way, is facing multiple and several crises itself. As we had at the end of the 1980s, at the beginning of the 90s, we had the crisis of socialism. But we have now the crisis of neoliberalism, which presented itself as an alternative. We have a real crisis for this system. And in our own country, there was a big debate in that period. Joe Slovo, Paulo Jordan, Harry Gwala were amongst those who criticized the problems, what was regarded as the problems of existing socialism. And they said there was a problem with this type of socialism. There were many differences amongst them, but all of them were saying something went wrong. There were deformities, there were pathologies in socialism that made it to be rejected by the people. But we now have some of the people who are celebrating the rise of this neoliberal alternative, market fundamentalism, that the human interest must be subordinated to profit and market forces. Even those who were saying to us 30 years ago that this is the way to organize the world are now accepting that there's a crisis. One of those scholars is Francis Fukuyama, who wrote the book called The End of History, pronouncing that that's the only way the world can work, is around organizing the world on the neoliberal democratic model. He's amongst those who are now saying he wrote a new book, and that new book basically says there is a big problem, neoliberal or liberalism or liberal democracy.